We've just begun to learn about the water and its secrets. Just as we've only touched on outer space. We don't entirely rule out the possibility that there might be some form of life on another planet. Then why not some entirely different form of life in a world we already know is inhabited by millions of living creatures?
Hello, and welcome to every single sci-fi film ever. I'm Aisha Khan. Today we'll be talking about Creature from the Black Lagoon from 1954, which was directed by Jack Arnold, who had been making quite a name for himself in the 50s as a science fiction director. The film was produced by William Alland, and the screenplay was written by Harry Essex, along with Arthur Ross. Now, both William Alland, Harry Essex, and Jack Arnold were also the team behind It Came from Outer Space, which we discussed a few weeks ago. To add a little context, I like to speak about the films that were big the year prior. In 1953, the biggest grossing film was The Robe, which is a biblical story starring Richard Burton and Gene Simmons. Other big grossing films of that year include the famous Western Shane and two Marilyn Monroe films, which are Gentlemen Prefer Blondes and How to Marry a Millionaire. We also have the star-studded From Here to Eternity and the science fiction film The Beast from 20,000 Fathoms. 1953 is also memorable because it was the year that Audrey Hepburn shot to fame starring in Roman Holiday. And with that, on to our wonderful guests. Jay Telotte is Professor Emeritus of Film and Media Studies at Georgia Tech. He has written/edited numerous books and articles on science fiction. Welcome to the show, Jay. How are you doing?
I'm doing just fine, Ayesha. How are you?
Good, thank you. Joining Jay, we have Mark Bold, who's a Professor of Film and Literature Studies at the University of West England, Bristol. He has also written extensively about science fiction. Welcome to the show, Mark. How are you?
I'm good today, thank you.
Brilliant. I wanted to begin with Jay, because Jay, you saw this film in the cinema, I believe, when it was released. Can you tell us a bit about that?
I did, and probably my parents should have been brought up on charges for child abuse, taking I probably was about 5 or 6 years old, which dates me easily, to see this film. And of course, I was mightily scared by it. And the only thing that helped after the fact was that my mother, who was something of an artist, she sculpted a head of the creature so that I could have it and not be afraid of it anymore.
That's a wonderful idea.
It was a nice bit of, I guess you might call it voodoo magic, but using art to overcome the effects of art.
Yeah, absolutely. Can we talk a bit about how this monster came about? Because Universal had a whole slew of monsters in the 30s, early 30s especially, and then going forward. And then this is like a good while after that. Well,
Universal certainly needed something big. Their finances had been very shaky. They hadn't had a really major profitable year since 1946. The monsters had always been a go-to for them, in part because you can never really kill the monster. The monster always manages to come back, and it manages to come back because we need sequels. And so they had the long cycle of Frankenstein films, of Dracula films, of Invisible Man films, and then the combinations of the two or three, and in fact, even more Wolfman films. And so they needed another franchise, not just a monster one, that's good, a franchise too. And they did have a few minor franchises that were helping them along in the early 1950s. The Ma and Pa Kettle films, whose appeal has always escaped me. And
Sorry, can you tell me what these are? Ma and Pa Kettle films?
These were old country folk who lived out in the mountains on farm, and were always brought into conflict with the New World. that new post-war world of technology, for example. And these films made lots of money.
And in regards to Creature from Black Lagoon, like, is it like a proper B movie? And how do we define that? Is it something that it depends how it's screened in the cinemas, or is it just a lower budget? How do we define a B movie?
Well, B movie tends to be budget primarily, and this was never really presented as a B movie. Certainly, Universal didn't present it to the public as a B movie. They emphasized the fact that this was a fairly costly film. It was $650,000 budget, so that put it squarely in the A bracket. The B films were things like Ma and Pa Kettle films, which were in the $200,000 to $250,000 budget. So this was presented as pretty much an A film. Their publicity materials all emphasized that this is a film you put at the top of your bill. If you are running a double bill, this is a film you put at the top of the bill.
Right, Mark, can I ask you a bit about the origin of this film, which has some shaky ground, I believe, on how this story started?
Yeah, the story's told of the producer getting the idea from a cinematographer who'd heard this story of an Amazonian legend of a half-man, half-fish creature. And we actually hear dialogue to that effect in the film as well. The ship's captain talks about this Amazonian legend. I've never encountered any evidence that such a legend actually exists, which isn't to say it doesn't exist. It's just that it seems too convenient and too easy to be the genuine origin. No one wants to say, we're going to do a King Kong knockoff. So you come up with this alternative explanation of its origin, and it lends a kind of exotic flavor to the film. And part of the way the film is promoted is through its exotic sensibility, whether it's the Amazon setting, the underwater photography, the use of 3D, all those things point to it being that kind of exotic colonial adventure narrative. And I don't know, that just seems, it's when you read accounts by like Columbus or Raleigh of discovering the New World and hearing stories of things like cannibals, it's always the next valley over. It's always, well, we've never seen them ourselves, but people in the next valley over tell stories of having seen them. And it has that kind of implausibility built into that distancing effect. If it wasn't the producer, it was a cinematographer. The cinematographer, whose name I forget, does have a Latinx name, so that lends perhaps a bit of authenticity to it. But I'm suspicious, and I've never seen any evidence that this is a true story.
And Jay, you'd mentioned that you're a bit suspicious because if Orson Welles had a good story to tell, he would be likely to tell it.
Yeah, that's the other part of the origin here. Is it sourced with William Alland, the producer? Is it sourced with Orson Welles? And Alland tells a story of hearing this legend told to him by Orson Welles, and therefore Alland began turning this into a story. But Alland also claims that he directed a number of scenes, and that's being contradicted by people who were involved in the film. So Alland is someone who's always sort of wanting to be bigger than he was. He had a long career in Hollywood. He appears in Citizen Kane. That's probably his main memorable role. But long career that was never tremendously successful. And so he's in various ways tried to stake claims to greater success. And I think the number of those efforts has actually produced the opposite effect. People have always been suspicious about his claims. But I wouldn't put anything past Orson Welles.
Yeah, William Alland apparently admitted the influence of King Kong on this, and he also said he was going to write a treatment based on Beauty and the Beast. Then it was handed over to Maurice Sim, and then on to scriptwriters Harry Essex and Arthur Ross. So that's the kind of apparent trail of the story, and probably doesn't come from any Amazonian legends. But if anyone knows different, let us know. We'll correct that in the show notes. Okay, let's move on to this monster or sea creature. The first thing I did want to point out, because I've been quite outraged about this ever since I found out, is the woman who created the monster, who didn't get credit for it for 50 years, apparently, is Millicent Patrick. And the guy who is the head of Universal's art department, which is Bud Westmore of the Westmore family, got apparently quite jealous of her, removed her credit, and she was supposed to do a tour. There's lots of information about that, which I will add in the show notes, including a whole book by a Mallory O'Meara. So that will be in the show notes.
I'd argue a bit with that.
I believe that it was kind of the pattern for the head of the department to take credit. I think that's kind of true, right?
That's true, but they also wound up having to redesign the creature after her original design. And in fact, in one of the interviews I read with Julie Adams, she talks about them having to shut down the production while they redesigned the creature, because the first design wasn't working out quite the way they liked.
Okay, let's move on to the actual monster in the film. And Jay, is this a sympathetic creature?
I think you can't help but be sympathetic at various times. This is not only a fallout of the Beauty and the Beast motif here, which we've managed to create sympathetic beasts all through the years, including Disney. But it also is fallout from using 3D, and that is you tend to have this monster reach out and touch you. You reach out and touch it. You are put in its eyes, inside the monster, looking at the people to get some of that 3D effect. And anytime you embody, anytime you subjectivize like that, you tend to almost enforce a sympathy. At the same time, the universal publicity went in the opposite direction. The universal publicity labeled it a monster. The universal publicity used, I almost find it disturbing the kind of rhetoric that they used. That is, they constantly talked about the dangerous desires of this monster. They talked about this. Let me offer you a quote. A monster raging with pent up passions. That's a little bit disturbing. Or a monster inflamed by dangerous desires for a woman's beauty. Again, another quote. And they're consistent all the way through the three creature films. I ran through the press books for those three films, and
which again, are the sequels. You mean?
Yeah, the sequels.
It is quite interesting because those underwater scenes are actually quite beautiful, especially where you've got Kay swimming along and you've got the monster kind of mirroring her emotions as he's going along. Mark, what do you think is behind this? I mean, we'll go into the sexuality quite soon, but first of all, what does he want? Is it just...
One of the things that gives him that sense of being a person is his own uncertainty about what he wants. That first stretching up of the hand towards Kay's feet, and that kind of, does he gently touch it? Does he not? One of many moments across the films that Spielberg nicks versions of for Jaws, or uses versions of in the Jaws movies. So it's not clear what he wants. And one of the changes that was made very later in the film to the original script is when the creature finally gets Kay and takes her into the cave. In Harry Essex's script, she's just dumped on the floor, but instead in the finished film, and this seems to have been Jack Arnold's rewrite, she's draped across this rock as if it's some kind of altar. And I think what we're seeing is very similar. It's kind of a sort of memory of King Kong, I suppose, and the sacrifice of Fay Ray. But also we've seen a very similar racial politics, which is operating much more cautiously in the film. So people have written about the creature costume itself being like a caricature of an African American with the broad flat nose, the big lips, things like that. People have written about the creature as being very, very phallic, resembling at times a penis.
Right.
And I think that's probably clearest in the first of the sequels, Revenge of the Creature, where you see it happen a couple of times in Creature from the Black Lagoon, where he kind of inflates his gills. In the first of the sequels, every time it looks like a couple's about to get it on somewhere, he wanders out of the bushes and he gets close to this big throbbing neck and head. So there's clearly, a sexual undercurrent to all of this. But what the publicity is doing is playing on that this is some form of miscegenation. This isn't just interspecies sex. This is being cast very much in the public panic around miscegenation as the civil rights movement is gaining strength, gaining force. Someone else has written about, and I'm sure Jay will be able to tell me who it is because I can't for the life of me remember, written about the posters for the films and the ways in which they have that very familiar image of the creature carrying the girl off in the dress, like the Forbidden Planet poster behind you.
That's me. I wrote that article.
It is you, but it's always in an urban setting.
People who aren't watching,
Yes.
The posters are on my threads, but I'll post something else on Instagram. But there is a very common trope of a robot or a monster, or a robot monster, actually, one time as well, which is that they carry beautifully stylish women who are, they're coming to take your women. All of these people. And in a lot of the films, as many people have pointed out, including you, Jay, it's like, for example, in Forbidden Planet, it's actually a man who gets carried by the robots, but that's not what they use for the posters.
Yeah. And so with the creature posters, what happens is that the posters emphasize urban settings, downtown areas, bridges, skyscrapers, and so on, precisely the kind of locations which don't actually appear in the films.
Good point.
You vaguely glimpse them in the second film, I think. And this is a time of, accelerating white flight from downtown areas. It will become much more pronounced over the following decade as the white middle class and working class families move out towards the suburbs, destroying the tax base, incorporating so as not to have to contribute to the urban tax base. And these become Black and Hispanic identified areas. And the posters are kind of pointing to that threat, just as the kind of language of dangerous desires is talking about miscegenation.
Yeah, I tend to push in a different direction with that, and that is the article that Mark was recalling that I did. Took that in the science and technology direction, and that is that it is technology that's coming to take away our desire, our not only our women but our desire, our sexuality. That is, we're becoming enslaved and invaded by this world of science and technology. That's why it's most often a robot carrying away the woman. We see it in this case with the Gill-Man, but he's a hybrid, just like robots are hybrids. And I think that is much more the overarching fear. It's an unconscious upwelling of unease at what's happening in culture in this period, and so I don't attribute this racially at all. I think it's much larger than that, and I think it's much more universal than that. And it is indeed, it's destroying our cities. It's destroying our lives. It's even destroying planets in outer space, as you see in the poster you have behind you for Forbidden Planet,
which I will put on Instagram for those who aren't watching. I can understand that with robots, but in this is very much a kind of primitive. I mean, it even starts with Genesis at the beginning, and then you have creatures coming out of the sea. So it is this idea of that we've evolved beyond some kind of primitive species.
This is what's going on in this film, and that is we have these scientists who cannot. Why haven't you gotten married yet? David is asked, right?
Yeah.
So they can't bring themselves to do what is natural anymore, and in fact, it's science that has opened up this Black Lagoon, that has opened up this primitive world. if science would mind its own, would get out of the way, we wouldn't have this issue.
I think the ambiguous status of the film as well feeds into this. It's, a creature feature, but creature features are out of fashion in the early 50s. So one of the other things that publicity does is insistently label it as a science fiction movie because science fiction is trending. This did enable Universal to, re-release yet again its horror movies. But the film then sits in this awkward position. And one of the first people to really write about this back in the 70s was Vivian Sobchak, who's trying to look at the 50s and come up with a hypothesis that will distinguish science fiction from horror by looking at the creature features. And she eventually says it's not really possible to do. But one of the things she tries out is the idea that science fiction features what she calls creatures, the giant monsters, the Godzillas, beasts from 20,000 fathoms and so on, which, and mutant things like the giant ants in them, which are kind of implacable and devoid of personality. And that's easy to read as some kind of metaphor for the bomb or science out of control, versus these more human scale creatures like the Gill-Man, which is actually, I think, the first full body costume monster in Hollywood history, where it's a single bodysuit, where you have human scale, and you also get a bunch of scientists have experiments go badly, and they, X the man with X-ray eyes, the 4-dimensional man, and things like that. And because of that human basis, there is still some sense of them being sympathetic. But regardless of what status they have, they are threatened, as Jay says, by this kind of increasing techno-scientific world that's ridding them of humanity. So even though they're sympathetic and the creature from Black Lagoon fits in there, there is also that sense that they are ceasing to be us.
And it is the scientists and the humans that come and invade this area. That's why it doesn't fit in with the general 1950s nuclear stuff, because it's like we're literally going in there, and it is more akin to something like King Kong.
Yeah, it's very unusual for Americans to be invading anywhere.
What do you have to say for yourself, Jay?
No, I think that is the nice inversion. One of the more interesting things about this film, and that is turning the humans into the aliens. And this is the sort of thing that maybe one of the hallmarks of Jack Arnold films, and that is Jack Arnold is someone who's not afraid to invert formulae in order to make them work, in order to let you see something that you wouldn't normally see, as he does in He Came from Outer Space, for example. This is a nice turn that Arnold does in a number of his films to make us see ourselves in a more revealing light.
And he does that throughout his career as well. So one of probably his last great film is a 70s blaxploitation Western, the full title of which I can't give you because the second word begins with N. But the first word is Boss, which is the first of the N. Charlie trilogy. And it's a black-centered Western. And, it's part of that important revisionism that begins to actually reflect much better the historical truth of the American West.
Very interesting. Before we move on to some more of the themes, I did want to talk about Kay, because everybody loves Kay, and the creature loves Kay. I absolutely adore Kay because she's very, very stylish. She is not a scream queen. She doesn't run around just screaming at everything.
Are you two married yet?
No, David says we're together all the time anyway. Might as well save expenses.
Did you ever hear of two living as cheaply as one?
That's what I keep telling him, Carl.
Well, I'm waiting for Williams to give her that raise, and she can afford me. Come on, let's go ashore.
She's surprisingly, for the time, 1954, she's independent, she's educated, and she has an opinion. And she is quite scandalously, as you've mentioned, Jay, unmarried.
So I'd say one of the other things I love about her is she does have basically a costume change for every scene.
Yeah, I love that too.
So, hold on, she wasn't wearing that a moment ago. She wasn't wearing that. She got changed between that and this. So clearly, independent income, and very, well-defined as a character as well. And unusually for a woman scientist in the period, she doesn't have a gender-neutral name.
Yes. Yes, like in Tarantula, there's a Steve.
That's not even a gender neutral name, is it?
Although
and as the character Mark says, Kate can take care of herself.
Okay, so let's go on to some of the major themes, which we've kind of touched upon. But one of the big ones is man versus nature, which has been going on for a while, I think.
Man versus nature, also re-articulating that sense that we get in things like Jekyll and Hyde, rational man versus beast man, and which is natural, which is more natural, how do they relate to each other, which the film clearly picks up on, and is very present there in the arguments between David and Mark about how science should operate in this world.
With that knowledge, perhaps we can teach men to adapt themselves to some new world of the future.
Nice speech, David, but there's still a practical side to it. If I sound brash and more like a banker than a scientist, try to remember that it takes money to run an institute like ours. A find of any real importance can be of great financial value to us also.
You know, it's one of the curious things. The film does recognize that science, the actual practice of science, no matter how, what science's own image of itself is, it is actually driven by economics, whether of the state or of corporations. But Mark is also positioned as the, violent extractionist. He's the one who's, compared to a big game hunter at one point, all he wants is proof.
Let it come from me, David. It'll give you a chance to get at him.
You're crazy.
Crazy to want to bring back the biggest find anyone's ever made? Oh, you don't know what this can mean, David, to all of us.
Mark, you're not going with me.
I am.
We have Mark on that side, representing in some way corporate violent extractionism, the end of science. And then David, who would prefer to study the creature in its own environment, to not rip it out of nature, to not treat nature just as this source of raw materials to be extracted and shipped home and turned into some commodity form, but to actually understand the creature in its relationship to its environment. Two different views of nature, both of them problematic in their ways. David's view is still nonetheless that nature is something separate from us to be studied, not something we too are part of. But they sort of doing this kind of really interesting recasting of beginning to think in environmental terms of how we view the world.
Jay, you were mentioning that the first ever Clean Water Act was passed not too soon before this.
There's a Clean Water Bill that we don't get the Clean Water Act until the official Clean Water Act until Richard Nixon in 1971. But there's a first Clean Water Bill is like 49 or thereabers.
Yeah, I think I've got 48 here, which is the first.
Okay.
Yeah, and it was
And then the Sierra Club has its first conservation campaign in 1951. The London smog crisis in 1952 suddenly opens people's eyes to the environment. 1953, Keep America Beautiful organization is formed. So there's a host of environmental organizations and environmental warning lights that are going off that are coming up in the period leading up to this film. And then we had that wonderful scene with Kay smoking on the boat, and she just casually flips her cigarette into the water. And on the one hand, that is a nice cinematic trick, and that is you motivate every shot, every cut, every camera movement. And so we motivate the movement of from her face down into the water, and then the creature underneath the water looking up at this cigarette, despoiling his environment. But it is also just an image of the human impact on the environment, as small as it may be, right there. We're starting in that direction. This is a nod in the direction of all these other campaigns that are starting up in the early to mid 1950s.
Now, in their warm depths, the miracle of life begins. In infinite variety, living things appear and change and reach the land, leaving a record of their coming, of their struggle to survive, and of their eventual end.
I didn't realize that evolution was so controversial for so long in the US. I thought it was a new kind of 1980s thing where it became kind of controversial again. But apparently, evolution did not become taught in biology textbooks in the USA until 1957, and that's after Sputnik. So it was probably like...
not quite accurate.
Okay.
The Scopes monkey trial in 1925, which is this famous test case in Tennessee, in which a school biology teacher with the unfortunate name of John Thomas Scopes was accused of teaching evolution in the classroom, which, thanks to the Butler Act, was illegal in Tennessee. The book he'd been using was a book from 1912, which did include evolutionary material in it. He always said he could never remember whether he actually taught that bit or not. But the ACLU wanted to test, wanted a trial that would test whether this ban on teaching evolution in schools was constitutional or not. So it's a famous trial. You have the fundamentalist, former Secretary of State and 3 times presidential nominee William Jennings Bryan prosecuting the case.
Wow.
And you have Clarence Darrow, the famous lawyer, defending the case, played brilliantly by Frederick March and Spencer Tracy in the first version of the film. So Scopes loses, Darrow loses, it goes on appeal, and it's dismissed on a technicality. So the Butler Act stays in force, banning teaching evolution in schools. At least a dozen other states take this as a signal to introduce similar legislation within a year. The Butler Act remains in force. It remains illegal to teach evolution in schools until 1967. And then in 1968, it's deemed on a federal basis to be unconstitutional. So any of the laws that passed were overturned at that point. So you have this long arc of basically a tension that's brilliant captured in the trial between the fundamentalist Jennings and the skeptic, agnostic Clarence Darrow. In the 50s, we get a change in the way that American evangelical Protestants are dealing with this. There is a massive Protestant revival in the 1950s. This is where evangelists like Billy Graham come to the fore. But they shift the ground. They realize they're losing some territory here. So they move from demanding that the biblical account of the creation is taught as science to coming up with the idea, and evolution can't be taught, to coming up with the idea basically of creation science, which is what, from the 60s onwards is the ways in which the kind of fundamentalist evangelical wing approach this, and then becomes to much greater prominence from the 80s and onwards as part of that kind of politicizing of public spaces and public discourse that the Christian right takes on as part of their, the Republican politics.
And yet a film like this begins with evolution as fact.
But it also begins with a verse in the Bible, which is exactly the position, that the Protestants were going through really in the 50s of how do we negotiate these. We argue, we move to the point of them actually being reconcilable with each other. The biblical account of creation is a kind of poetic account of what happened, and evolution is the mechanism that God used.
In the beginning, God created the heaven and the earth was without form and void.
Jay, something that I found really interesting you were talking about is the difference between what you called outer and inner science fiction. Now, by inner, we don't mean like in our brains, but in Earth. And there is a whole slew of films in the 1950s which deal with under the sea, into the deep, ocean. Can you talk a bit about that?
Well, for many people, science fiction in the 1950s was what we might think of as centrifugal, and that is, it's about flying out into space. And this is what they're seeing on television, because the dominant television science fiction is the space opera. We've talked about space operas on this show before with Flash Gordon and Buck Rogers. But you also start seeing, and this is relatively new. I mean, it's not the first time, because We can go back to Méliès and find him going down, to the bottom of the sea as well, in the 1890s and early 1900s. And we have the one major epic science fiction film in the U.S., Mysterious Island in 1929, which is all about going down to the bottom of the ocean and finding a new civilization there. But this is the point at which we really start moving in that other direction. Let's look at what's happening under the seas. Let's look at what's happening in this world that we actually know very little about. And therefore, if we know very little about it, it can have untold possibilities, untold dangers as well. Disney's 20,000 Leagues Under the Sea, which is one of the most successful films of the same year as Creature, but A Monster from the Ocean Floor, the same year as Creature. Beast from 20,000 Fathoms, the year before. It Came from Beneath the Sea, the year after. Attack of the Crab Monsters. I guess we might even throw Godzilla in here as well. So this is a sudden fascination with the undersea world, and television with a TV show like Sea Hunt, which becomes one of the most popular syndicated television shows in early U.S. television history in the 50s and 60s. It's one of the tie-ins that Universal tried to work with this film, try to get advertising that will go along with swimsuits and aqualungs and scuba gear and snorkeling and things like that. The America that's coming up with leisure and leisure time activities is moving towards.
And it's interesting that you'd mentioned that even though this film is 3D, it kind of is in juxtaposition to the message of the film.
MGM had done they had done three of these demo sci-fi films, and the one thing they learned is you have things going at the camera. And that demonstrates three-dimensionality. So we have all this stuff coming at us. We have things floating at us. You want to reach out and touch those things. It makes you part of. It brings you into their world. It brings that world into our world. It makes contact. It's a technological contact. And yet, here's a film that is about the dangers of that contact. And that's why I suggested that that's almost at odds with itself. The technology that they're being forced to use is almost at odds with the thrust of the film as Jack Arnold is trying to tell his story. And that is, we have to be aware of the dangers of that contact, the dangers that we might do to that world might do to us. But should be a hesitation, a thoughtfulness involved in that contact, not simply a relishing of the frissons that balls and spears and harpoons and whatever or reaching webbed claw hands out at us, what they might offer us.
That sense of contact and not contact is quite subtle and variable and flexible, depending on how 3D is being used. And I think Jack Arnold and the guy who shot the underwater sequences, whose name I forget, I do actually do quite a good job of exploring and making a different kind of spectacle than the shock spectacle out of it.
Right.
And some of that goes into the second film, which was also shot in 3D, but was shown even less frequently.
Let's go into the legacy of this film, and to begin with, we'll go to the sequels, which I did not enjoy as much as the first film.
Yeah,
I think part of the issue with the second one is that in the first one you can withhold the creature, you can choose when to reveal the creature. In the sequel, all people want to see is the creature or a cardboard cutout of him or what have you. So the film has no choice but to spend a lot of time with the creature. And obviously the is it Rico Brown, the underwater actor, has a redesign of the costume, so it actually has an aqua lung in it this time. It's not just holding his breath. But the film doesn't know what to do with him. So all it can do is show us him being chained underwater, then going on a rampage, and then randomly throbbing at people until enough time has passed that the film ends. It doesn't seem to quite know what to do, but show us lots more of the creature and lots of big aquarium underwater photography.
And that's the other appeal that we were talking about earlier, and that is this fascination with the underwater world and the rise of these aquariums everywhere. This is a later phenomenon. This is not something that people were familiar with in the 1940s. But the other issue, and I think Mark is dead on right with the fact that the creature is too much with us. The other problem is that the people are too much with us and they're not very interesting or good. We don't have a Julie Adams here.
Man, we've got a blonde.
We don't have characters who are fleshed out very well.
It feels like they're hitting the marks. Like, okay, attractive, stylish woman. What kind of drama can we have amongst the relationship? It feels like they're hitting the marks without actually developing any kind of depth or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the third one, what have they done to this poor monster? He looks in some ways even more monstrous. Basically, it turned him into Frankenstein. And he's not.
So the third one is he's a man under there after all. He's just got some kind of scales that need to be removed.
He is a lungfish that now gets to walk out of water, but now can't go back into the water. So it's playing around with man playing around with evolution, as it were. We're going back to Island of Lost Souls in the 1930s, where we can sculpt humanity out of the animal world. So it's an older theme, and it's not pulled off nearly as well. Island of Lost Souls, everything is atmospheric. There's no atmosphere here. This is out in the open. Let's turn this person into a sun dweller.
Yeah. Having said that, I agree with that entirely, but I also do slightly prefer Creature Walks Among Us to Revenge of the Creature. And I think one of the reasons for that is it does try to invest a little more in the human characters and the conflict between the human characters. Mm-hmm. And obviously, just as Richard Carlson in the first film is kind of the face of science fiction cinema in 53 and 54, here we have the cast of This Island Earth reunited.
Yeah.
And there are, the human drama or melodrama has entertainment value because it's so overblown and over the top, and it leads to some curious moments of probably accidental comedy with the third wheel, particularly the ship's crewman or guide. I'm never quite sure what his job is, who keeps hitting on the scientist.
That's a polite way of putting it.
Yes, actually, yes, hitting on and then attempting to rape. But he's at one point told to go and sew some clothes out of sailcloth for the creature, and he doesn't do a bad job of that.
Yeah.
So I think, and it's slightly shorter runtime and not so obsessive focus on underwater photography does ring a change. I think the second one, with so much of the aquarium photography, is really building on that, obviously in a different screen format, that kind of travelogue appeal of this is Cinerama. We will show you miraculous things from around the world, or here in the States that you haven't visited in person, we'll show you this kind of spectacular tourist destination, which becomes immensely boring, particularly 70 years later or whatever it is. Yeah, the third one's terrible as well, but it has its moments.
I think I find it quite funny, and I think it's the third one where he goes off swimming and then he comes to, what is it, like a dance club or somewhere, and he climbs in. And I was thinking, if it was a modern day nightclub, he would fit right in, but because it's the 1950s, he's like, everyone's like, oh my God, there's a monster.
Oh, that's the other good thing about the second one. It's just after that, isn't it? In the second one, where they have the gay couple, the two gay men out driving together, who discover the woman on the beach, the woman's body on the beach.
I must have missed the kind of gay coding in there.
Well, it's
I did too.
Not overly pronounced, but it's certainly driving in a car sat close enough together across the front seat that one of them has his arm around the other.
Oh.
And actually, the third one was successful enough at the box office that they were planning a fourth movie, but it never came together.
Which might be a nice little place to segue to the film I finished watching just this morning, which I'm so excited about that I can't wait however many years down the line I'm actually going to cover it, which is The Shape of Water, which is kind of like the unofficial remake sequel, whatever it is, by Guillermo del Toro. Thoughts on that, guys?
Well, there's a long history of attempting to remake these movies. So in 82, John Landis was going to produce a Nigel Kneale scripted version directed by Jack Arnold. In a decade later, John Carpenter was supposed to do a version with Rick Baker doing effects. In 95, it was offered to Peter Jackson. In 96, Ivan Reitman was going to do it. Yeah. In 2001, Gary Ross, the son of one of the original screenwriters, was going to do it. In 2002, Guillermo del Toro was hired to write it, and the project was closed down because he didn't like the idea of the creature getting the woman getting the creature. Then Breck Eisner was going to do it in the early 2000s. Then in 2014, it was going to be part of the Universal Dark Monster franchise, which they kept changing their minds as which was the first film in the franchise, as one after another they failed until The Mummy failed. And James Wan is currently working on a version as well, the guy coming out of Saw, Insidious, Conjuring, but he has just made the Aquaman movies as well, so he might be getting typecast. But Guillermo del Toro comes back to this project and never quite lets it go. So Abe Sapiens in the Hellraiser movies isn't created by del Toro. It's Mike Mignola, the comic writer, but clearly he likes his fishmen. And then I'm utterly enchanted by Shape of Water. It's this kind of wonderful confection. It's filmed in Canada, but set in Brooklyn in '62. It has the kind of memory deeply rooted in it of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein, James Whale's Frankenstein, and Creature from the Black Lagoon. It's heavily indebted to 1930s anti-fascist Popular Front depictions of France, constant accordion music going on in the background. And
it is such an ode to old cinema. It's beautiful.
Yeah, absolutely. And it has this beautiful coalition of a disabled woman, an illegal alien fish guy, a black working class woman, a gay man, and the kind of scientist guy who is a socialist, not a Soviet, though forced to work for the Soviet Union, kind of bringing out that kind of idealistic version of science's own self-image, fighting the military-industrial complex and the awful, vile Michael Shannon who likes his women not to talk. It's a thing of beauty, but I showed it in induction week to our first years. It's like the first day at university, and we always show them a recent film. And we thought, well, this is the one we'll pick. It's like nominated for 13 Oscars, wins 7. What could be more inoffensive than that? And 3 years later, I discovered quite how mortified my students were. I was 18 years old, didn't know anyone in the room, and made to watch this film, which begins with a woman masturbating in a bath and ends up with having sex with a fish.
Yeah.
So, some mixed feelings about it.
The reason I never watched it is 3 separate people told me it was really disturbing and weird and gross. And so I was like, I don't want to watch a film like that. And I think I really appreciate the fact that I watched it after having watched all the films that I've watched for the podcast so far, but then Creature of the Black Lagoon, from the Black Lagoon, and these two. And then when you see it within that context, it's just so much richer for everything. I thought it was beautiful.
Well, Del Toro said that he had never been able to let that story go, as he saw it when he was 6 years old, and it just stayed with him and haunted him. Although he certainly wanted the creature to get the girl and to get away with the girl, and so this is his chance to live out his dream. to give shape to his not only water but to his dreams. The other thing I like about his work is his approach to fantasy texts of all sorts. He says that fantasy is, and this comes out of his background in what we call magical realism. That he said that the fantasy is infinitely more realistic than realism, because we all have our fantasies, and so and our realities, our individual realities, are tied to those fantasies rather than to some sort of objective world that a lot of people might agree to. That embrace of fantasy and realism, that linking of the two, is probably the real strength of this film. The weakness, and this is where I have to disagree with Mark, is that army that he's enlisted of the handicapped woman and the black cleaning lady, and et cetera, that is so in your face. There's nothing subtle here. And there really is an awful lot of reality here when you kind of
tokenize everyone.
Exactly. It is that tokenism that I find offensive, because it says you don't have to think about these things. We're going to tell you. We're going to enlist everything that is different here, and we'll underscore them. We'll underscore that difference, and we'll draw. And here's one of the problems. Fantasy is rich. Fantasy doesn't have to be black and white. And unfortunately, he does draw black and whites here.
Yeah, no, I really enjoyed it, because to me, it's the little people rising up against, like you said, the military industrial complex, and also just Michael Shannon, who does that disgusting evil man so well. I was like, I wonder how his family live with him. He does it so well.
I think it really fits in that trajectory of Del Toro's Spanish language films more than it does his English language films, in which all of them, but particularly Devil's Backbone and Pan's Labyrinth, he pits imagination and fantasy against fascism. And I think that's inflecting this film in a way that, he struck this deal with the studio that if he brought it in for under $20 million, he'd have final cut. And he brought it in for something like $19,950,000. And so you imagine how a studio might have recut this to strip that bit of politics, some of that politics out of it.
I just wanted to take a few quotes. I read an article in Wired about the making of this new Shape of Water Fishman. And so apparently Del Toro said, make it like a George Clooney of Fishmen, which I just found really hilarious. Because it is just a fishman at the end of the day. And apparently there was a huge... Guillermo was very keen on making the creature have a nice butt, Hill says, adding that Del Toro carried a picture of the creature's rump around for weeks to get input from friends and family. Do you guys have any recommendations for listeners on what they can pair with this film?
If you like Creature, then you don't really need to see the two sequels, but you do look at Shape of Water, and you do look especially at Arnold's Incredible Shrinking Man. I think that's maybe brilliant is too strong a term. It is an extremely thoughtful science fiction film, one of the most thoughtful science fiction films of the 1950s. I'd also, and this is sort of playing off of a point that Mark brought up earlier, I'd also suggest, if you want something to read Bradley Shower's book, Escape Velocity, about films of the 1950s, because he does a nice job of describing that difficult negotiation between science fiction and horror in the American cinema.
Okay, great. Mark?
So I've got a couple of things. It's a classic. It's about 30 years old. It's Mark Yankovic's Rational Fears, American Horror in the 1950s, which clearly positions this as a horror film. But it does have one chapter in it, the films of Jack Arnold in the 1950s, which is a good, fairly basic, but good introduction to his movies. But the other book I would absolutely recommend, it's fiction. It's by Rachel Ingalls, published in 1982, Mrs. Caliban. And it's one of the inspirations for Shape of Water as well. Apparently Del Toro knew it. And it's a little feminist fable about a woman in a really unhappy marriage. And one day a creature escapes from the local scientific aquarium and appears at her back door, and they become lovers. And he's a fish man. And it's very funny and quite heartbreaking.
Oh, okay. Interesting. Very interesting. Okay, great. Thank you so much for your recommendations and for all the information that you shared with us and for coming on the show.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
Good to see you again.
Wonderful. That's it for this episode. Next episode, we will be discussing Them. So check out the show notes to find out where you can watch that. If you do have time, please try and leave a rating or review, as it really helps the show get to more people. And even better than that, if you could share it with someone you know who happens to like old science fiction films and history, that would be amazing. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.